My name is Dr. Thomas Wright, and I've spent my whole life searching for creatures that most people think don't exist. You might call me crazy. Lots of people do. But after what happened in the Everglades back in 1983, I know I'm not. I was 52 then, with gray starting to show in my beard and too many miles on my old Winnebago Brave. That RV was my home, my lab, and my office all rolled into one. She wasn't pretty, but she got me where I needed to go, rattling down dirt roads and parking in places most people wouldn't dare to camp. It all started when I got a call from Linda Blackwood, a wildlife photographer I'd worked with before. She was 34, fearless with her camera, and had this way of catching things on film that nobody else could see. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking with excitement, "I've got something big, really big. You need to get down to Florida." Linda had been taking pictures in the Everglades when she noticed something strange. The animals were acting weird. Alligators moving in perfect lines, birds flying in shapes she'd never seen before, and fish glowing in the water like Christmas lights. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. She'd found footprints, bigger than any humans, and they were giving off readings on her radiation counter. I knew I needed help from someone who really knew the Everglades, so I called Carl Martinez. Carl was 45, a local guide who'd grown up in those swamps. He was the kind of guy who could read the water like a book and knew every bird call by heart. But when I mentioned the glowing water and the footprints, he got real quiet. All he said was, "My grandmother used to tell stories about the swamp guardian. I always thought they were just stories." We met up at an old research station deep in the swamp. My Winnebago barely fit on the narrow dirt road, but we made it. The air was thick and humid, making my shirt stick to my back, and the mosquitoes were having a feast. But none of us cared. We could feel it in our bones. Something big was about to happen. That first night, as we sat around the small table in my RV planning our research, I had no idea we were about to uncover something that would change our lives forever. The Everglades held a secret, and we were about to find out just how far it would go to protect itself. I'm going to tell you everything that happened over those next few weeks. Some of it might sound impossible, and there are parts I still have trouble believing myself. But I swear on everything I know that every word is true. This is the story of how we met the skunk ape and why we chose to keep it secret until now. The first weird thing we noticed was the silence. If you've ever been to the Everglades, you know it's never really quiet. There's always something. Frogs croaking, birds calling, insects buzzing. But that first morning, as we set up our equipment, everything was just still. "This isn't right," Carl said, looking around nervously. He'd brought his old hunting rifle, and I noticed his hand kept drifting toward it. There should be at least 50 different bird species making noise right now. Linda was setting up her cameras around the camp, carefully placing them to catch anything that might move in the darkness. "Look at this," she called out, waving us over to a muddy patch near the water's edge. There, pressed deep into the mud, was a footprint bigger than my boot. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was how the mud around it seemed to be giving off a faint greenish glow. I pulled out my Geiger counter. I always carry one because you never know what you might find in this line of work. As I held it over the footprint, it started clicking like crazy. "That's not normal," I muttered, writing down the readings in my notebook. Carl crouched down next to the print, his face serious. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the swamp guardian," he said quietly. "She said it was here long before any of us, protecting the land. Said it could talk to the animals, make them do its bidding. I always thought she was just trying to scare me into staying away from the deep swamp." Just then, we heard a splash that made us all jump. About 50 feet away, a line of alligators was swimming in perfect formation, like soldiers marching. I'd studied alligators for years, and I'd never seen anything like it. Linda grabbed her camera and started taking pictures. That night, we gathered in my Winnebago to look at Linda's photos. The alligators were clear enough, but there was something else. In the background of one shot, partially hidden behind a cypress tree, there were two glowing red eyes reflecting back at the camera. "Could be just an animal's eyes catching the flash," Linda said, but she didn't sound convinced. We were all trying to be scientific about it, trying to find logical explanations. But deep down, we all knew we'd stumbled onto something bigger than any of us had expected. The air felt heavy with secrets, and the swamp around us seemed to be watching, waiting to see what we'd do next. None of us slept well that night. The silence was broken only by occasional splashes in the water and strange whistling sounds that Carl swore weren't from any bird he knew. I kept thinking about those glowing footprints and how they reminded me of the stories I'd been chasing my whole life. But this time felt different. This time, I had a feeling we were getting close to something real. Maybe too close. The next few days got stranger and stranger. We started noticing a smell, like rotten eggs mixed with wet dog, that would come and go without warning. At first, we thought it might be the red tide that was happening in the water, but this was different. The smell always seemed to show up right before something weird would happen. One morning, Linda found all her cameras turned around, pointing in different directions. Not broken, just moved, like someone, or something, had carefully picked each one up and turned it. The ground around them was muddy, and there were those big footprints again, still giving off that faint green glow. "Look at this," Carl said, pointing at some marks on a nearby tree. They were claw marks, but they were 8 feet up the trunk. "Whatever made these was standing upright," he said quietly, "and it was big." That afternoon, the sky turned a weird greenish color, and a thick fog rolled in out of nowhere. It had a strange smell that made our eyes water. "Everyone inside the Winnebago now," I shouted. Something in my gut told me that fog wasn't natural. Through the RV's windows we watched as shapes moved in the mist. Big shapes. We could hear splashing in the water, and the fog seemed to glow in places like it was filled with fireflies. Linda tried to take pictures through the window, but they all came out blurry. "My grandmother," Carl said, his voice shaking a little. "She said the swamp guardian could make poison air to keep people away from its home." I never believed her until now. The fog lasted for hours. When it finally cleared, we found something that made my heart stop. There, pressed into the mud all around the Winnebago, were dozens of footprints. They made a perfect circle around our camp, like whatever made them had been pacing around us the whole time. But the scariest part wasn't the footprints. It was the message. Someone, or something, had arranged broken branches on the ground to spell out words. "Leave now." Linda's hands were shaking as she took pictures of the message. "Maybe we should listen," she whispered, but we couldn't leave. Not yet. We all knew we were onto something big, something that could change everything we thought we knew about what was possible. Besides, the creature could have heard us in the fog if it wanted to. Instead, it just gave us a warning. That night, as we sat in the Winnebago looking at Linda's new photos, we heard something huge moving outside. Through the windows we could see trees swaying, even though there wasn't any wind. And then we saw them. 2 glowing red eyes, higher up than any normal animals would be, staring right at us from the darkness. None of us moved. None of us even breathed. The eyes stayed there, watching, for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute. Then they disappeared into the darkness. "I have to get a picture of it," Linda whispered, grabbing her camera. "This is the closest it's ever been." "Linda, no," Carl said, but she was already heading for the door. That was Linda, brave or crazy, depending on how you looked at it. She'd always said a photographer had to take risks to get the shot that mattered. We watched from the window as she crept out into the darkness, her camera ready. The moon was bright enough to see her moving between the trees. Everything was quiet again, that unnatural silence that meant something was wrong. Suddenly, all our equipment went crazy. The radio started spitting out static, our flashlights flickered, and my Geiger counter was beeping like mad. Then we heard Linda scream. "Linda!" I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, Carl right behind me with his rifle. The air felt thick and heavy, like walking through water. That rotten egg smell was back, stronger than ever. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees. We could hear splashing in the water, lots of it, coming from all around us. When we reached the spot where we'd last seen Linda, all we found was her camera on the ground. The lens was cracked, but when we checked the last photo, our blood ran cold. There, in the final shot, was a massive shape standing on two legs. It was dark and blurry, but you could make out thick fur, those glowing red eyes and hands that looked almost human, but much, much bigger. "Thomas," Carl's voice cracked as he spoke, "there's something I need to tell you. When I was a kid, my little sister went missing in these swamps. They never found her, but before she disappeared, she told me she'd been seeing a giant creature watching her from the trees. Nobody believed her. I didn't believe her. But now—" A loud roar cut through the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. It was followed by splashing sounds and Linda's voice in the distance calling for help. We ran toward her voice, but the swamp seemed to come alive around us. Alligators slid into our path, forcing us to change direction. Snakes fell from tree branches. Even the birds seemed to be diving at us, driving us back toward the Winnebago. It was like every animal in the Everglades was working together to keep us away from Linda. Back in the RV, we tried to radio for help, but got nothing but static. Our phones wouldn't work either. We were cut off, trapped in a metal box while somewhere out there, Linda was with that creature. And the night was only half over. "We have to go after her," I said, gathering up supplies. "But first, check out this photo again." I pointed to something in the background of Linda's last shot, an old cypress tree with a strange marking on it. "Carl, does that symbol mean anything to you?" Carl leaned in close. His face went pale. "That's it. That's the mark my grandmother said showed the way to the Guardian's home. It's in an ancient cypress grove deep in the swamp." We packed water, flashlights, and Carl's rifle, though we both knew bullets probably wouldn't help much against whatever we were dealing with. The animals that had stopped us before were gone now, almost like we were being allowed to pass. We followed Carl's memory through the dark swamp. The water got deeper, and the trees grew bigger and older. That's when we started seeing the glow. Not just from footprints now, but from the water itself. It was like the whole swamp was lit up from underneath. Finally, we reached the grove. The cypress trees here were enormous, their trunks wider than my Winnebago. And there, in a clearing, we found Linda. She was sitting calmly on a fallen log, her camera in her hands, completely unharmed. "Linda," I called out, "are you okay?" She turned to us, smiling. "I'm fine. Better than fine. You need to see this. Both of you." That's when it stepped out from behind the largest cypress tree. In all my years chasing mysterious creatures, I'd never seen anything like it. The skunk ape was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to shimmer with that same greenish glow we'd seen in the water. Its eyes were red, yes, but not angry red, more like the warm red of a sunset. And its face, it looked almost human, but older somehow, wiser. But the really strange part? I wasn't afraid anymore. None of us were. The air around us felt calm, peaceful. That's when we realized it wasn't just standing there, it was trying to communicate. Images filled my head, like watching a movie, but inside my mind. I saw the Everglades as they were hundreds of years ago, pure and clean. I saw the creature protecting the land, working with the animals to keep balance. Then I saw what was happening now. Pollution seeping into the water, trees being cut down, animals getting sick from the changes humans were making. "It needs our help," Linda said softly. "That's why it let me take pictures. It wants people to know what's happening here, but in the right way. Not as some monster story, but as a guardian who's been protecting this place since before people came." Carl was crying. "My sister," he whispered. "You showed her the same things, didn't you? and she promised to keep your secret, to help protect this place." The creature nodded slowly. Then it showed us one last thing. A vision of the future. Two possible futures, actually. In one, the Everglades was dead, just empty water and mud. In the other, it was alive and thriving, with people and nature working together to protect it. The choice, it seemed to say, was up to us. We stayed there talking. Yes, talking, though not with words, until the sun started to rise. We made a deal that night. We would tell the world about the environmental problems in the Everglades, show them Linda's photos of the pollution and the sick animals. But the skunk ape itself, that would stay our secret. Sometimes we learned the best way to protect something isn't to prove it exists, but to protect the place it calls home. That's why I'm only telling this story now, after 40 years. The Everglades is healthier today than it was back then. More protected, but it still needs help, still needs people who care. As for the skunk ape, well, if you're ever deep in the swamp and smell something strange or see eyes glowing in the dark, just remember, it's not there to scare you. It's there to remind you that some places are worth protecting, no matter what. My name is John Reynolds, and I'm a history teacher from Denver. What happened to my family during our summer vacation at the Grand Canyon still gives me nightmares. I've decided to write it all down, hoping that maybe it will help me make sense of everything we saw and felt during those terrifying days. It was the summer of 1965, and I had finally saved enough money to buy a beautiful 1963 Airstream Overlander, a shiny silver camping trailer that my wife Marie and our kids, Peter and Elizabeth, absolutely loved. We planned this trip for months. As a history teacher, I wanted to show my family the incredible stories and cultures of the American Southwest. The Grand Canyon seemed like the perfect place to start. The drive from Denver was long but fun. Peter, who was 14 then, kept his nose buried in comic books most of the way. My 12-year-old Elizabeth spent hours looking out the window, pointing at every interesting rock formation we passed. Marie, always the practical one, made sure we had enough snacks and water. It was the hottest summer anyone could remember, but our Airstream's air conditioning kept us comfortable. We arrived at Desert View Campground late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to set, painting the canyon walls in beautiful shades of orange and red. As I was setting up our campsite, Elizabeth tugged at my sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the canyon rim. "There are people watching us up there." I looked where she was pointing but saw nothing except heat waves dancing over the rocks. "It's probably just tourists, sweetie," I said, though something about the way she said it made my skin prickle. That evening, as we sat around our campfire roasting marshmallows, Peter found something in the dirt near our campsite. It was a piece of broken pottery, covered in strange symbols that looked like warnings. I should have taken it as a sign, but being a history teacher, I was just excited about the archaeological find. We didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything started to change. The next morning, when I asked a Native American guide about good hiking trails, he looked at the pottery piece and his face went pale. He refused to take us to certain areas, mumbling something about forbidden paths and those who walk between. I remember checking my watch. It was 10 a.m. We decided to explore on our own, following a well-marked trail. 3 hours later, we checked the time again. Somehow, it was still 10 a.m. All our watches had stopped at exactly the same time. That's when the first dust storm came, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It swirled around us like a brown tornado, but something wasn't right. The dust felt ice cold against our skin, even though it was over 100 degrees that day. When it cleared, the trail looked different. What was worse, we could see what looked like a park ranger station in the distance, something I knew for certain wasn't there before. "Marie," I called to my wife, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see that building over there?" She squinted into the distance. "You mean that small wooden structure? Maybe we can ask for directions." I started walking toward it, but Elizabeth grabbed my hand. "Daddy, stop," she cried. "There's nothing there. It's just the edge of the cliff." I froze. Elizabeth had always been special, more aware of things than most people. Looking more carefully now, I noticed how the supposed ranger station seemed to shimmer like a mirage. If I hadn't listened to my daughter, I would have walked right off the canyon rim. We hurried back to our campsite, but even that felt wrong. The paths kept changing, like someone was moving them around when we weren't looking. Peter swore he could hear footsteps behind us, but every time we turned around, there was nothing there, just swirling dust and dancing heat waves. That night, we locked ourselves in our airstream. The metal walls felt safe, but the sounds outside, they weren't normal desert sounds. We could hear what sounded like people walking around our trailer, whispering in a language none of us understood. Marie held Elizabeth close while Peter helped me check all the windows and doors. "Dad," Peter whispered, pointing to the window, "look at the wall of our trailer." In the moonlight, I could see strange symbols carved into the silver metal of our airstream, symbols that looked just like the ones on the pottery piece Peter had found. They seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, and they were still warm to the touch, as if they had been burned into the metal. What happened next made my blood run cold. Elizabeth started crying, pointing outside. Through the window, we could see what looked like Marie standing by the picnic table waving for Peter to come out. But Marie was right there with us, holding Elizabeth. "They're trying to trick us," Elizabeth sobbed. "They want to separate us. Don't look at what they show you. It's not real." That's when we realized we weren't just lost or confused. Something was hunting us, and it could make us see things that weren't there. The question was, why us? And more importantly, how were we going to survive? The next morning, Marie insisted we get help. While the kids stayed in the airstream, we walked to the main ranger station, the real one this time. We made sure to stay together, knowing now that anything we saw when we were alone couldn't be trusted. At the station, we met Dr. Sarah Thompson, a researcher studying the history of disappearances in the canyon. When we told her about what was happening, her face turned serious. "You've been marked," she said quietly, looking at the photos we'd taken of the symbols on our trailer. "These are ancient warnings about the skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures that have haunted these canyons for centuries. They're hunting you, testing you. They create illusions to separate families, lead them into the canyon." She stopped talking when she saw how scared we looked. "But there's hope," she added quickly. "They have rules they must follow. They can't touch innocent souls. That's why your daughter can see through their tricks. And they hate it when families stay together, support each other. That's their weakness." On our way back, everything started going wrong. The paths kept changing again, but this time it was worse. We saw whole roads that hadn't been there before, fake parking lots filled with cars that disappeared when we got close, and people walking around who vanished like smoke when we tried to talk to them. Peter grabbed my arm. "Dad, look." He pointed to what seemed to be our airstream, parked about 50 feet away. But that was impossible. We had left our trailer in the opposite direction. "It's not real," Marie said firmly, squeezing my hand. "Remember what Dr. Thompson said. We have to stay together." As we turned away from the fake trailer, we heard Elizabeth screaming in the distance. Then we heard her voice again, coming from another direction. And another. The creatures were using our daughter's voice, trying to make us run in different directions to look for her. "Mom! Dad! Help me!" The cries were everywhere now, but Marie held her ground. "Our real Elizabeth is safe in our real trailer," she said, though I could hear the fear in her voice. "We have to trust that. We have to stay together." We walked carefully, checking every step. Sometimes the ground ahead looked solid, but Elizabeth had taught us to look for signs that things weren't real, like how fake rocks didn't cast proper shadows, or how mirage people never blinked. But the hardest part was ignoring the voices of our children calling for help, knowing they were just tricks to separate us. Finally, we made it back to our real airstream. Peter and Elizabeth were safe inside, just as we'd left them. But something was different now. The air had turned ice cold, even though it was the middle of a hot summer day. Dark clouds started forming around our trailer, but they weren't normal clouds. They moved like they were alive, reaching down with finger-like shapes toward us. "Get inside," I yelled, but as we ran for the door, dark figures stepped out from behind nearby trees. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with eyes that glowed like dying campfires. More appeared from behind rocks and bushes surrounding our trailer. "Dad," Elizabeth whispered, her hand trembling as she pointed to the symbols on our trailer. "The marks are glowing." She was right. The strange symbols that had been carved into our airstream were now shining with an eerie blue light. The creatures seemed to be chanting something, their voices like dry leaves scratching against rocks. Marie, who had treated all sorts of injuries as a nurse, suddenly grabbed my arm. "John, look at their movements," she said. "When they walk, they're avoiding the light from our trailer's reflections. They can't stand their own reflection." That's when I got an idea. Our Airstream's silver surface was like one giant mirror. If these creatures hated reflections, maybe we could use that. I ran to the truck and started the engine. "Everyone inside the trailer now," I shouted. "Hold on to something." Peter looked at me with wide eyes. "Dad, what are you going to do?" "Something crazy," I admitted, "but sometimes crazy is all you've got." I hooked the trailer to our truck as fast as I could while the dark figures crept closer and closer. Their illusions were getting stronger. I could see multiple versions of our family members scattered around the campsite, calling out to each other in confusion. But we knew better now. The real Marie, Peter, and Elizabeth were safely inside our trailer. I jumped in the truck and started turning it in a wide circle, using our shiny Airstream like a giant mirror to reflect the last rays of sunlight. The creatures hissed and backed away from the light bouncing off our trailer's surface, but I knew we weren't safe yet. They were still out there, and they weren't going to give up easily. Then Elizabeth screamed from inside the trailer, "Dad, stop! Look up!" Through the windshield I saw what had scared her. The dark clouds above us had formed into something like a giant whirlpool in the sky, trying to lift our trailer off the ground. The skinwalkers were using their strongest magic now, desperate to separate us. "The symbols," Marie shouted over the wind. "Elizabeth, what do you see when you look at the symbols?" Elizabeth pressed her hand against the glowing marks on our trailer wall. "They're not just marks," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "They're like a story about a family that stayed together, no matter what." That's when Peter did something incredibly brave. He opened the trailer door, holding tight to the handle as the wind tried to pull him out. In his other hand, he held the piece of pottery we'd found that first day. "Elizabeth," he yelled, "help me read it." Together, my children traced the symbols on the pottery, matching them to the ones glowing on our trailer. As they did, the marks glowed even brighter, like blue fire. The light spread across our entire Airstream, reflecting off every surface. The creatures screamed, not like humans, but like the howling wind in a deep canyon. The light from our trailer was everywhere now, bouncing and reflecting, growing stronger instead of weaker. I realized what was happening. They had marked our trailer to track us, but Elizabeth's innocent understanding of the symbols had turned their own magic against them. Marie grabbed my hand. "John, drive. Head for the main road." I pressed the gas pedal, driving through the ring of creatures. They couldn't stay solid in all the reflected light, turning into shadows that scattered like dust in the wind. The dark clouds above us broke apart, and suddenly we were in normal sunlight again. We didn't stop driving until we reached the park's main entrance. When we finally pulled over, our Airstream was scratched and dented, but the symbols had stopped glowing. We were safe. That night, in a motel far from the Grand Canyon, we all slept in the same room, leaving the lights on. The next morning, I asked everyone what they wanted to do. We still had 2 weeks of vacation left. "Let's go home," Elizabeth said quietly. "But can we stay at some really busy campgrounds on the way back?" We all laughed, but we agreed. Some places, we learned, are better left to their ancient guardians. Our family had faced something impossible together and survived. The scratches on our airstream faded with time, but we never forgot what happened. More importantly, we never forgot how staying together had saved us. Sometimes at night, I still dream about those dark figures and their tricks. But then I hear my family's steady breathing in the next room, and I know that as long as we have each other, no magic, no matter how dark, can tear us apart. My name is Mark Phillips, and I've spent most of my life guiding people up and down mountains. For 20 years, I showed tourists the beautiful trails of Mount Rainier, until that one terrible day changed everything. I stopped being a guide after losing 2 climbers in what I thought was just a regular storm. But now, 3 years later, I'm back on the mountain, and this time, I know the truth. Those weren't normal storms at all. It all started when Jennifer Hayes, a smart meteorologist with wild curly hair and determination in her eyes, contacted me about strange weather patterns on Mount Rainier. She had charts and data showing impossible temperature drops and weird storm formations that didn't make any sense. At first, I didn't want to help. The mountain held too many bad memories. But when she mentioned the exact same weird weather patterns from the day I lost those climbers, I knew I had to go back. David Cooper joined us too. He's younger than Jennifer and me, but he's one of the best search and rescue experts I've ever met. He brought all sorts of high-tech equipment in his backpack and had this confident smile that made you feel safe, even when things got scary. We packed Jennifer's old 1989 Toyota Dolphin RV with supplies and equipment. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, with just enough room for the 3 of us and all our gear. Jennifer filled one whole corner with her weather machines, while David stored his rescue equipment under the small dining table. I remember looking at all our stuff packed in there, thinking how this felt different from my usual climbing trips, more like a mission than a regular mountain visit. The drive up to Paradise Visitor Area was quiet. Spring had come early to the lower slopes, with little patches of wildflowers peeking through the melting snow. But something felt off. The air was too still, like the mountain was holding its breath. Jennifer kept checking her weather equipment, frowning at readings that made no sense. The forecast said clear skies, but dark clouds were gathering above the peak, swirling in ways clouds shouldn't move. "This is exactly what I've been tracking," Jennifer said, pointing to her laptop screen. "The temperature keeps dropping in random spots, then shooting back up. It's like something's playing with the weather." I nodded, remembering that day 3 years ago. "Just like before," I whispered, but I didn't tell them everything yet. The guilt of those lost climbers still sat heavy in my chest, and I wasn't ready to share that story. Not yet. We parked the RV in the Paradise lot, one of the last vehicles there as evening approached. The visitor center was closing up, and the few tourists left were hurrying to their cars, sensing the weird weather coming. Dark clouds now covered the whole peak, and the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. David checked his rescue gear one last time, while Jennifer set up her weather station outside the RV. I stood there, looking up at the mountain I used to know so well, feeling like a stranger. Something was up there, something that had been there 3 years ago, and now we were going to find out what it was, whether we were ready or not. That first night, none of us slept well. The wind kept getting stronger, making the RV creak and shake. Around midnight, Jennifer's weather equipment started beeping like crazy. We all rushed to look at her computer screen. "This can't be right," she said, rubbing her eyes. "It's showing temperatures dropping 30 degrees in just minutes, then shooting back up again. That's impossible." David looked out the window with his flashlight. "The snow's falling sideways," he said quietly. "I've never seen wind patterns like this." I felt my stomach tighten. The last time I'd seen weather this strange was the night I lost those 2 climbers, but I still kept quiet about that. Early the next morning, we started hiking up one of the less-used trails. The snow had stopped, but the sky still looked wrong. Too dark in some places, too bright in others. After about 2 hours of climbing, David spotted something through his binoculars. "There's some kind of old building up ahead," he said, pointing to our left. "Looks abandoned." We carefully made our way over. It was an old mining camp, probably from 50 or 60 years ago. The wooden buildings were falling apart with broken windows and caved-in roofs. But what really caught our attention were the signs nailed to the trees around it. They were old and rusty, but we could still read them. "Danger. Keep out. Evil dwells here. Turn back now." "Probably just kids playing pranks," David said, but he didn't sound too sure. Jennifer walked around the camp with her equipment. "Guys," she called out, her voice shaking a little. "The temperature just dropped 20 degrees right here, but it's normal 10 feet away." That's when we heard it. A low rumbling sound from up the mountain. At first, I thought it was just thunder, but the sound kept getting louder, and the ground started to shake. "Avalanche!" I shouted. We ran for the closest solid thing we could find, a big boulder sticking out of the snow. As we pressed ourselves against it, I saw something through the curtain of snow that made my blood run cold. Something huge and dark moved through the white wall of the avalanche like a shadow walking through mist. The avalanche roared past us, but somehow it split around our boulder like water around a rock. That's not natural. Avalanches don't do that. When everything got quiet again, we all looked at each other, knowing we'd just seen something that shouldn't exist. "What was that?" Jennifer whispered. I finally spoke up. 3 years ago, before I quit being a guide, I saw something just like it. Right before I lost those 2 climbers. The wind picked up again, stronger than ever, and the temperature started dropping fast. We needed to get back to the RV, and we needed to get there now. Getting back wasn't easy. The snow was falling so thick we could barely see 10 feet ahead. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and it felt like it was pushing against us on purpose. By the time we reached the RV, our faces were numb from the cold. But something was wrong. The RV's door was open, swinging in the wind. Inside, everything was frozen solid. Frost covered Jennifer's computers. David's rescue equipment was buried under snow that had blown in. Even our water bottles were frozen solid. "This is impossible," Jennifer said, checking her thermometer. "It's 60 degrees below zero in here, but only in here. Outside, it's just below freezing." David tried to radio for help, but all we got was static and this weird, low humming sound. He checked his satellite phone, too. Nothing but that same strange hum. "We're stuck here," I said, looking out the window at the wall of the white snow surrounding us. "At least until this storm passes." That's when we heard something hit the roof. Thump, 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 like footsteps, but too heavy to be human. Jennifer grabbed her flashlight and pointed it at the ceiling. We could see the metal roof denting inward with each step. David quietly opened his backpack and pulled out a flare gun. The footsteps moved to the back of the RV, then stopped. For a few seconds, everything was quiet. Then we heard something that made us all freeze, the sound of sniffing, like a huge animal trying to catch our scent. "Look," Jennifer whispered, pointing at the back window. We could see a shadow moving out there, bigger than a bear, with long arms that almost touched the ground. Then it disappeared into the storm. We spent that night huddled together in the frozen RV, taking turns keeping watch. Nobody slept much. The storm kept getting worse, and sometimes we'd hear that sniffing sound again, circling around us in the darkness. The next morning, David found something in the snow near the RV, an old backpack, torn and weathered. Inside was a journal, the pages stiff with ice. The last entry was from 2 years ago. It controls the storms, uses them to hunt. If you're reading this, get out while you still can. My hands started shaking. I recognized the handwriting. It belonged to one of the climbers I'd lost 3 years ago. "There's more," David said, his voice heavy. He pointed to a spot about 50 feet from the RV. The storm had uncovered what looked like a cave entrance in the rock face. Around it were more backpacks, old climbing ropes and gear from different decades, all torn and frozen. "It's been here a long time," Jennifer said quietly. All these people, they all got trapped here, just like us. The wind was getting stronger again and the temperature was dropping fast. We could barely see the cave now through the swirling snow, but we could hear something, that low humming sound again, coming from deep inside the cave. And this time, it sounded like it was calling to us. "We need to check that cave," David said, grabbing his rescue gear. "It might be our only shelter if this storm gets worse." I didn't want to go in there, but he was right. The RV wouldn't protect us much longer in this cold. Jennifer gathered her working weather equipment, and I grabbed some climbing ropes and flashlights. We tied ourselves together with the rope. In this weather, getting separated would mean death. The cave entrance was partly hidden by ice, but inside it was surprisingly warm. Our flashlights showed a tunnel going deep into the mountain. On the walls, we found old paintings, the kind Native Americans made hundreds of years ago. They showed a tall, dark figure standing in storms and on mountain tops. Jennifer stopped to take temperature readings. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "The tunnel is getting warmer the deeper we go, but there's no heat source." That's when David's flashlight caught something ahead, a big, open space. As we entered it, we all stopped and stared. It was a huge cave, and it wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, and there were stone pillars with more paintings on them. In the center was what looked like a stone table, surrounded by old bones. "It's a burial chamber," I whispered. "An ancient one." Jennifer walked around the cave with her equipment. "Guys, the weather pattern. It's not random. The cold spots, the storms, they're all centered around this place. Whatever's causing them is protecting this chamber." Suddenly, David's radio crackled to life. Through the static, we could hear voices, old recordings of distress calls playing over and over. Some I recognized from the day I lost my climbers. Others were much older. "The creature," I said slowly, "it's not just hunting. It's guarding this place." Right then, we heard that heavy footsteps again, coming down the tunnel. The temperature started dropping fast. Jennifer's equipment went crazy, beeping and flashing. "Look at the paintings," she said quickly. "Every time someone disturbed this place, the creature appeared. It's like a guardian spirit, a really angry one." The footsteps got closer. Ice started forming on the walls. David pulled out his flare gun, but I grabbed his arm. "No," I said. "I think I know why we're still alive. 3 years ago, when I lost those climbers, they wanted to explore some caves. They didn't listen when I said no. But we're not here to disturb anything. We just want to understand." The creature appeared in the tunnel entrance. In our flashlight beams, we could finally see it clearly, tall as 2 men with skin like dark ice and eyes that glowed like the northern lights. It raised its long arms and the wind in the tunnel began to howl. "Nobody move," I whispered. The creature took a step toward us, ice spreading across the ground with each step. Jennifer's weather equipment was going crazy, showing temperatures dropping faster than ever. Then David did something I'll never forget. He slowly took off his backpack and set it down. "We mean no harm," he said in a calm voice like he was talking to a scared animal. "We understand now. This is your sacred place." The creature stopped. The wind died down a little. It tilted its head, looking at us with those glowing eyes. But then everything went wrong. Part of the ceiling cracked from all the ice forming on it. A chunk of rock fell, hitting the stone table. The creature let out a roar that shook the whole cave, and suddenly the storm was inside with us, whirling around like a tornado. "Run!" I shouted. We turned and ran back toward the tunnel, but ice was forming everywhere, making the ground slippery. The creature was behind us, its footsteps shaking the ground. The wind was so strong it nearly lifted us off our feet. David stumbled and fell. As Jennifer and I turned to help him, he looked up at the creature getting closer. Then he looked at his flare gun, and I saw the decision in his eyes. "David, no!" Jennifer screamed. "Get to the RV!" he shouted back. He pointed the flare gun at the cave ceiling, not at the creature. "I know what to do." The creature was almost on him. David fired the flare. It hit the ice-covered ceiling and exploded in a burst of red light. Cracks spread through the ice, and then the ceiling started coming down. David rolled away from the falling rocks, trying to reach us, but the creature was there. The last thing we saw was David throwing his arms up as a wall of ice and rock came down between us. "We have to go back," Jennifer cried, but I pulled her away. The whole tunnel was coming down now. We ran as fast as we could, the sound of crashing rock behind us. We barely made it out of the cave before the entrance collapsed. The storm outside was worse than ever. We fought our way through the snow back to the RV. Behind us we could hear the creature's roar, but it sounded far away now, muffled by tons of rock. We got the RV started and drove down the mountain through the storm. Jennifer was crying, and I could barely see through my own tears. We both knew David had saved our lives by sacrificing himself. The storm followed us halfway down the mountain before finally fading away. When we reached the bottom, the sky was clear, like nothing had happened. We had Jennifer's weather data and my story, but we knew nobody would believe us about what really lived up there. That was 5 years ago. I'm still a mountain guide now, but I never take groups to that part of Mount Rainier. Sometimes, when the weather gets strange up there, I think about David and the creature and that ancient burial chamber. The mountain keeps its secrets, and maybe that's how it should be. But every now and then, I hear stories from other climbers. Stories about weird storms that appear out of nowhere and a tall, dark shape seen in the snow. When I hear these stories, I just nod and tell them to stay away from the old caves. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Some guardians never stop watching. My name is Richard Turner, and I'm a geology professor who loves studying rocks and the way they form. What I'm about to tell you happened during the hottest summer I've ever experienced, in a place called Death Valley. Even now, 3 years later, I still get chills thinking about it, despite the burning heat we faced back then. I wasn't alone on this trip. Helen Morris, a smart scientist who studies how plants and animals survive in the desert, came along. She's younger than me, but knows so much more about desert life than I ever will. Then there was Frank Watson, an old prospector who spent more time in Death Valley than anyone I know. He's the kind of guy who can tell you stories about the desert all night long, his weathered face lighting up and talks about his adventures looking for gold and precious stones. We were traveling in my 1970 Dodge Travco RV. Picture a big, clunky house on wheels with olive green stripes down the sides. It wasn't pretty, but it was home for what we thought would be a simple research trip. The weather report said it would be hot, really hot, maybe even record-breaking. But none of us knew just how strange things would get. We parked near Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America. It's a vast, flat area covered in salt and sand that stretches as far as you can see. The first few days were normal enough. We took samples, made notes, and sweated more than I thought possible. Helen kept pointing out weird patterns in the sand, like something had been drawing circles when we weren't looking. Frank would get quiet whenever we talked about them, and I could tell something was bothering him. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I found some ancient drawings carved into rocks. Petroglyphs, we call them. They showed strange, swirling shapes that seemed to dance across the stone. That's when Frank finally told us the stories he'd been keeping to himself. Tales of prospectors who went missing over the years, their camps found empty except for odd patterns in the sand around them. I laughed it off at first. Being a scientist, I like things I can explain. But then, as the stars came out that night, we all saw something that made my heart stop. A shape, like a wave in the sand, moving by itself across the desert floor. It wasn't the wind, there wasn't any. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. And that was just the beginning of our nightmare in Death Valley. That night, none of us could sleep. The temperature kept changing in weird ways. 1 minute we'd be sweating. The next, we'd feel cold, even though that never happens in Death Valley at night. Helen kept checking her thermometer. shaking her head as it jumped from 100 degrees to 70 and back again. "This isn't natural," she whispered, her flashlight beam dancing across her notes. "Air temperature doesn't just change like this." Frank sat by the RV's tiny window, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "There's something out there," he said quietly. "Something that's been here longer than any of us." I tried to stay logical, like a good scientist should. "Maybe it's just hot air mixing with cold air from the mountains," I suggested, but even I didn't believe that anymore. Every few minutes we'd see shadows moving across the sand like waves in the ocean, but we were in the middle of a desert. The next morning, things got worse. We found our research equipment scattered across the sand, but not like animals had done it. Everything was placed in perfect circles with strange, swirling patterns drawn around them. When we tried to drive the RV to a different spot, the wheels just spun. The sand around us had become so soft and deep that we couldn't move. Helen discovered something really scary when she looked at her desert photos from the day before. In every picture, there was a faint shape in the background, like a person made of swirling sand. But when we looked at the same spots in real life, nothing was there. "Look at this," she said, her hands shaking as she showed us more photos. "It's getting closer in each picture." Frank's face went pale. "Just like Thompson back in '63, he muttered. "Found his camera in the sand. Every picture showed something getting closer, but they never found him." That's when our radio started picking up strange sounds. Not static, but something that sounded almost like whispers in the wind. We all heard it, and we all knew that whatever was out there in the desert wasn't going to leave us alone. As the sun began to set, things got even scarier. The sand around our RV started moving in ways that made no sense. It was like watching water flow uphill. Helen tried to take samples, but every time she got close, the sand would shift away from her tools. "We need to stick together," Frank warned, but right then the desert had other plans. A huge wall of sand rose up between us, and suddenly I couldn't see Helen or Frank anymore. I could hear them calling my name, but their voices seemed to come from every direction at once. I stumbled through the swirling sand, trying to find my way back to the RV. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. A tall figure made entirely of spinning sand, with empty dark spaces where eyes should be. It moved toward me, not walking, but floating across the ground like smoke. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. All those years of studying rocks and geology hadn't prepared me for this. But then I noticed something odd. Wherever the creature passed, tiny crystals in the sand sparkled in a strange pattern. As a geologist, I knew there had to be a reason for that. "Professor Turner." Helen's voice cut through the chaos. She had managed to circle around and find me. "The patterns in the sand, they're all leading somewhere." She was right. Every swirl, every strange movement was pointing in the same direction. Frank appeared behind us, out of breath but alive. "There's an old cave system down that way," he panted, pointing where the patterns led. "Been sealed up for years. Locals say it's cursed, but—" Before he could finish, another wall of sand rose up, and the temperature dropped so fast our water bottles started to freeze. We had no choice. We had to run toward the caves. It was either that or face whatever was playing with us in the open desert. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what it wanted us to do. The cave entrance was barely big enough to squeeze through. Frank went first, then Helen, and I followed last. Just as I got inside, I heard that weird whisper again, closer than ever. Our flashlights showed a tunnel going deep into the ground, with walls that sparkled like they were full of tiny mirrors. "Look at these crystals," Helen whispered, shining her light on the walls. "They're everywhere." Frank moved his flashlight beam across the cave floor. "Footprints," he said softly. "Old ones, lots of them going in, but none coming out." The temperature kept changing as we walked deeper into the cave. Hot, cold, hot, cold, like the cave was breathing. Our flashlight beams bounced off the crystal walls, making strange shadows dance around us. Sometimes I thought I saw people in those shadows, but when I looked again, they were gone. Then Frank stopped suddenly. "Wait," he said. "Listen." We heard it, that whisper again, but this time it was coming from behind us. The sand creature was in the cave with us. We could see its shadow on the wall, getting bigger and bigger. "Run!" Frank shouted, pushing us ahead. "I'll hold it back." "Frank, no!" Helen cried, but he wouldn't listen. "Been in these deserts 40 years, he said, pulling out an old miner's pick. "About time I found out what's really out here. Go! Find out what it wants." The last thing we saw was Frank standing his ground as a wall of swirling sand filled the tunnel behind him. The sound of falling rocks told us the tunnel had collapsed. Frank was gone, and we were trapped deeper in the cave with no way back. Helen grabbed my arm. "Richard, look." She pointed ahead, where the tunnel opened into a huge cave room. The walls were covered in more of those ancient drawings I'd seen earlier, but these were different. They seemed to tell a story, and as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. I finally understood what we were dealing with. "The drawings," I whispered to Helen. "They show the creature was trapped here, in these crystals, thousands of years ago. Look, these symbols show it was feeding off the desert's heat." Helen's flashlight beam shook as she studied the walls. "That's why the temperature keeps changing. It's not just controlling the heat, it's eating it." Just then, the sand creature flowed into the room like water pouring down the walls, but this time it was bigger, filling almost the whole cave. Those dark, empty eyes stared at us as the temperature dropped so low our breath turned to fog. That's when I noticed something. "Helen, the crystals, they're glowing when it gets really cold." Helen's eyes lit up. She understood too. It can't handle the cold. That's why it needs to steal heat. The creature lunged at us, but we dove behind a large crystal formation. I remembered my geology lessons. These types of crystals reflect heat and light. "Helen, all the flashlights, point them at the crystals." We aimed our lights at the biggest crystals and the whole cave lit up like a mirror ball. The light bounced everywhere, and where it hit the sand creature, its shape started to break apart. It made a sound like a howling wind as it tried to stay together. Then we heard a familiar voice shouting, "Over here!" It was Frank. He hadn't been crushed. He'd found another way around through a small tunnel, and he had his old mirror-polished prospecting pan with him. "The more light, the better," he yelled, holding up his pan to reflect even more light around the cave. The creature was weakening. Every flash of reflected light made it lose more of its sand. Finally, with a sound like a tornado dying out, it collapsed into a harmless pile of sand on the cave floor. We stood there shaking, hardly believing we'd survived. Frank grinned through his dusty face. "Well, professors," he said, "I reckon that's one for the history books." It took us hours to find our way out of the caves. When we finally got back to the RV, it was like nothing had happened. The sand was normal, the temperature was hot but steady, and the desert was quiet. We packed up and left Death Valley that day. Sometimes I think about going back to study those cave drawings more carefully, but then I remember those empty eyes in that swirling sand, and I decide maybe some mysteries are better left alone. Frank still lives out there, though. He says desert feels different now, more peaceful, like something that was angry for a very long time is finally resting. As for Helen, she wrote a research paper about unusual temperature patterns in Death Valley, but she left out the part about the sand creature. Some things are hard to explain in scientific papers. Me? I keep a flashlight by my bed now, just in case, and whenever I hear the wind blowing at night, making that whisper-like sound, I remember that there are still things in this world that science hasn't explained yet. Maybe that's what makes it all so interesting.